Good afternoon and welcome to Still We Rise, African Americans at the UConn School of Law, an intimate panel discussion with Constance Belton Green, class of 72, as well as our new dean, Dean Eboni Nelson, and our assistant dean, Karen DeMeola. It's my privilege as president of the Law School Alumni Association to invite you to this event. I'm joined again with my co-host, Dean Nelson, and immediate past president of the Law School Alumni Association, Christine Jean-Louis. In late 2019, the Law School Alumni Association began to continue the efforts of prior presidents and adopted our first strategic diversity and inclusion strategic plan. What followed was the formation of our first Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and we began the process of planning a series of events that we hope will continue well after this one. Of course, then the pandemic hit, and the world we are operating in now is one that is very different than the world that we were all in late 2019 and early 2020. And certainly with the death of George Floyd, and so many other really tragic events affecting the lives of Black men and women, now seemed an appropriate and important moment to have this conversation about the experiences of African Americans at our beloved alma mater, the UConn School of Law. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to the co-chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee and past president, Christine Jean-Louis, to introduce and welcome our esteemed panelists today.
Hi, everyone. It took me a second to unmute myself, but welcome, and we hope you enjoy this presentation and this discussion. We want to keep this interactive, so please use the chat feature for those who are on computers and can see the chat feature to provide questions that our panelists are going to answer during their discussions. We are moderating it, so we will try to integrate that when Cecil provides some questions subsequently after our presenters present. So without further ado, we'll start off with Constance Belton Green, who is the first African American to graduate from UConn Law. She's from the class of 1972. And then from there, we will talk to Karen DeMeola, who is the class of 1996, and then end with Dean Eboni Nelson, who is our present dean for the past month at UConn Law. And then Cecil will moderate the discussion. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Connie.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, everyone. Still We Rise presents a lens for looking at diversity at UConn Law. It describes from a Black perspective the law school's cultural past. Based on primary and secondary sources, it identifies challenges and achievements of African American alumni and faculty. Although the primary focus is 1969 to 1979, information is included before and after that decade. On a personal note, I have worn many hats during my career in law and education, from private practice to chief diversity officer to more recently, historian. In Still We Rise, we hear the narratives of others who have had similar or different experiences at UConn Law than our own. It is my hope that this resource is used to continue our dialogue on how we define our law school community. In 1937, Daniel Fletcher became the first African American to graduate from UConn Law. By 1969, the following African American men had graduated: William Graham, Paul Lewis, Alfred Rogers, Eugene Spear, Thomas West, and John Valencia, a total of 7 since the law school founding in 1921. Entering in September 1969 were 6 African American students, 4 were in their first year of law school, and 2 were transfer students entering their second year. What was the cause of this modest influx, the largest class of Black students that UConn Law had ever had? The answer? Well, there were changes occurring at the national, state, and local levels. For example, the civil rights movement at the national and state level. Protests for better jobs and housing were occurring in cities like Hartford. Interest in diversity was beginning to bubble up on the law school campus. So when these 6 students arrived, what did they encounter? There were no Black faculty. There was a registrar who was Black, in addition to 1 secretary and the custodian. The large brick law school building located in West Hartford offered no actual campus community. There had been no real thought given to how to retain these students in this law school environment, this all-white environment. The faculty had focused on 2 other goals: to attract faculty of national reputation and to increase financial assistance for law students, including out-of-state students. And so, our first objective in August of 1969 was to find housing. I'll share with you a personal story on this point. When my father and I arrived at UConn Law School, Dean Lane gave us a list of homes in the neighborhood, the West Hartford neighborhood, which is adjacent to the law school. And these homes were on the list because they rented rooms, mostly 3rd floor apartments. It had been the law school tradition. My father and I agreed that renting in the West Hartford neighborhood seemed to be a safe and convenient solution for my housing needs. But suffice it to say that it did not go well. After knocking on several doors and being told that either no space was available or that they had decided not to rent after all, my father and I knew that the list that the dean had given us had not been met for a Black woman law student. Yet, Tim Rogers, Harold Thompson, Milton Thomas, Ken Davis, Ron Powell, and I developed our own agenda during the fall semester of 1969. It was as follows: to recruit more students of color, to establish a law school affinity group, all would be welcome, and to connect to the Hartford community. And we set about accomplishing these tasks during that academic school year. We were awarded $9,000 by the University of Connecticut, the larger, not just the law school, the larger university, for a recruitment and community project, and starting a community project. We recruited by traveling primarily to historically Black colleges. We established a chapter of the Black Law Students Association, the National BALSA. We established a chapter at UConn, and we started to create a community clinic at Charter Oak neighborhood in Hartford. I want to share with you a couple of narratives of that period from other alum. I'd like to highlight just a few, and it's really around the 2 questions why I chose these narratives: what it means to have grit, and how do you find ways to thrive in an environment that was not actually intended for you. In 1970, Bessie Warren Bennett, class of 1973, entered the law school. At the time that she enrolled, she was a wife, mother of 3, and teacher in the Hartford public school system. But Bessie was also a 1958 graduate of Radcliffe College, and after graduation, she had been admitted to Harvard Law School. She deferred admission, but not her law school dream, and later became the first Black woman admitted to the Connecticut bar in 1974. Bessie, in her own words from a much earlier interview, stated that in her time at the law school, it seems as though some faculty treated her as if she was just taking up spaces. Remember the Vietnam War and that period and the beginning of women being in law school? So this idea of just taking up spaces, how could she possibly be serious about becoming a lawyer? Linda Kelly, class of 1976, spoke about not worrying about fitting in at the law school or not being in a study group. Quote, "I don't know if I ever fit in because it was something that was not going to happen. You learn to deal with life and still do the best that you can." And Vanessa Bryant, class of 1978, talked about her daily routine of finding a quiet space in the library and staying there until all her work assignments were done. She did not focus on the fact that some white students had formed study groups. Marsha Whitney, class of 1973, ran for president of the Student Bar Association his third year at the law school. He had gotten very involved through BALSA and voting rights, even traveling to Mississippi to monitor voting during his law school tenure. He ran for president, but did not win, noting that in running for SBA president was the first time that he recalled hearing racial slurs at the law school. Eric Coleman, class of 1977, talked about the importance of friendships he had made and study groups formed that were initiated through basketball pickup games. Quote, "We studied together and we socialized together." Between 1977 and 2004, 5 Black faculty were hired. The first was John Britton, a civil rights trial lawyer who later became instrumental in the Chef v. O'Neill lawsuit. Others to follow were Paula Bonds, Robin Barnes, Willa Jean McLean, and Karen Gustafson. Still at UConn Law today is Professor Willa Jean McLean. I want to note one comment, or we did many interviews, but I want to note one comment by Professor Gustafson. And Professor Gustafson was at UConn between 2004 and 2014. And I quote, "I remember there was a week when I said to a white student, when I had a white student drop by my office who said, 'I love this campus. It's a campus where everybody says hello and everybody is so friendly.' The next day, a Black student is in my office and says, 'Being in this campus is oppressive. No one even makes eye contact with me when I cross the quad.' I admit, in closing, that there have been challenges in our past, and still today. But along the way, we gain new perspectives. That is why I'm so pleased that Karen and Eboni are here with me today to join in the discussion. Karen, I think I'm not sure, Karen or Eboni? I think it's Karen, right?
It is.
Yeah.
So just so everyone knows, we're taking a past, present, and future approach to this. So we'll hear from Dean DeMeola on the present.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Dr. Green. You know, this book was pretty amazing for me. And when I read Dr. Green's draft, and she asked me to sort of frame up the present of African American students at the law school. It was painful, right? I was reminded of my own experiences at the law school, and I think for me, what sort of solidified my approach to administration now that I'm on staff was based so sort of unconsciously in my experience as a law student. And so in the 90s, I joined my first year of law school was in 1993. My first friend, Felice Gray Kemp, who is amazing, and if you don't know her, you should. She was the first person I met, first person that I sort of attached myself to, right? It was someone who I felt had similar experiences that we could identify around identity lines. And it was wonderful. We had a cohort of students who came in together, sort of this pre-orientation, and it took us maybe a hot minute to realize that we were all students of color, and the ways in which that informed my experience, right? Like the ways in which students of color were separate. We were assumed to have less intellectual acumen, more economic need, and that permeated itself throughout my first year of law school. And that was demoralizing and it was marginalizing. And I thought things had changed. And so when I was reading the book, I was struck by that. And I remembered those moments, right? And I was so taken aback by the way things had not changed. And then flash forward into my time when I started back at the law school as an administrator, as a director of admissions in 2000. I was sort of remembering all my favorite students and the ways in which the institution looked less diverse then than it did when I was a law student. And so I took those experiences that I had, and I made sure that students of color, students who were in marginalized groups, members of the LGBT population, people with disabilities, felt like they belonged at our institution. And that's been my hope, my goal, my approach throughout my time at the law school, because that, yes, I had those moments, and my classmates had those moments of feeling marginalized, but we had one person who we could go to. That person was Dean Hugh McGill. Every week we could walk into his office and say, this happened, that happened. We could express ourselves in ways that were honest and authentic, and he listened, he understood, he took action. And that felt wonderful, right? It felt like we were heard. Another piece that was so salient as I came back to the law school was the power of BALSA, right? The Black Law Student Association that was created, Connie, when you were there, and continues today, was such a source of empowerment, of belonging, of acceptance, not only for me as a law student, but certainly for law students who came after that. And after me, and who continue today as that one resource where guidance is given. There often seem to be two sets of rules, right? The systems that are set up for some and not for others. The ways in which we may be excluded, individuals may be excluded from conversations, from study groups, from opportunities like clerkships or jobs. It takes intentional action on the part of the gatekeepers. Right, we have gatekeepers in admissions, we have gatekeepers in careers, in the clerkship process, in student organizations, in the bar examining committee, the bar association, right? There are gatekeepers who continue to allow people in and keep people out of our profession. And so what do we do with those gatekeepers when we recognize that people aren't treated equally? And so having an organization like UConn, in particular now, when we know we have individuals who are so mindful and intentional in the ways in which they share opportunities, how they engage with our students and our student organizations, is so heartening and wonderful. Because we know that there are systemic issues within our profession that our profession was not set up. It was set up as an exclusionary profession, mostly for wealthy white landowners, right? And keeping out women and people of color in particular. And so now that we're in 2020 and we see the shift, We understand that each individual comes to the law school with a narrative, that narrative is honored by our institution. But we also recognize that we still have some work to do, and that we want to have engagement. We want to make sure that our students feel like they are part of our community and are getting the same opportunities as students in the majority. And that over time, that's been difficult, right? It's been hard to maintain a sense of positivity and to have an open door when you could see the results, right? Every time we have, you know, when I started admissions, we were faced with, on a national front, litigation against state institutions who were doing targeted enrollment, right? And so, and as a state institution, the inclination, of course, was to back off. But the then Dean of Admissions and I, when I joined, we made a concerted effort to be intentional. I'm sorry if you could hear all the work that's being done behind the wall in front of me, the construction. There's no good place in the house, so I apologize. We made an intentional decision, right, that we were going to recruit. We were not going to leave recruitment on the backs of our students, right? That additional burden that was placed on students in the 70s, we got to take that away in 2000s, right? We didn't need, we had a commitment by the staff that we were going to ensure that our classes were diverse. And so, yes, does BALSA still help? SALSA, LALSA, APALSA, Lambda, FedSoc, all the organizations help with the recruitment of our students. But it's our responsibility as an institution. And so that institutional shift that we saw in the 2000s certainly helped change the class dynamics. And I know that Christine has some questions for us later, but, and we could certainly talk about what the dynamic looks like now, what the demographics look like now during the Q&A. But again, I want to leave you with a few things. One, that institutionally, things are different in terms of our approach to the student body, right? That we are much more inclusive and diverse than I certainly felt when I was a law student. Number two, that BALSA has been a tremendous resource and asset for our students for many, many years, and that continues today. And there's great hope for the future of the law school and the future of diversifying the profession by the efforts and the actions of all the people on the panel, Dean Nelson, Dr. Green, attorneys Thomas and Jean-Louis have spent their careers really focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the profession. I'm really proud to be part of this panel, so thank you for including me.
Thank you so much, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the UConn and Law School Alumni Associations for co-hosting this important event, especially Cecil Thomas, Christine Jean-Louis, Allison Swain, and Colby Plaskowitz. Sorry, Colby. It is truly an honor to have this opportunity to participate in this important conversation with two inspiring trailblazers, Connie Green and Karen DeMeola. Thank you both so much for your powerful remarks. And Connie, I especially want to thank you for penning this incredible, wonderful book. Although I'm not an alum of UConn Law School, the experiences that you recounted were very familiar to me, as I too attended a predominantly white law school here in the Northeast. The lack of Black faculty was familiar to me. The exclusion from study groups was familiar to me. Finding a safe space, a home, a supportive family in BALSA was familiar to me. So thank you for writing this important book that reflects so many of our Black experiences in law school, both within UConn Law as well as outside of it. It is such an honor to serve as the new dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law and to be part of this incredible, remarkable legacy of African Americans at the law school. It's a legacy that so many of you on the call and participating in this important discussion has helped to create. Indeed, I stand on the shoulders of Connie and Karen and all African American students who have passed through the halls of our law school. I stand on the shoulders of Professor John Britton, the first African American faculty member at the law school. And I'm proud to say that when I began my career in the academy at Texas Southern University Thurgood Marshall School of Law, John Britton was there. We spent a couple of years together, and he has been an inspiration to me ever since then. As dean, one of my top priorities is to enhance institutional excellence by elevating diversity, equity, inclusion, and community. For me, diversity of all kinds and academic excellence are intrinsically linked to one another. My varied experiences with DEI work at my previous institutions, at national organizations, they've all taught me that success in this area does not come easy. It takes a lot of hard work, intentionality, as Karen mentioned, buy-in, resources, and commitment, especially from the top. While DEI efforts should be incorporated throughout an institution, they can often suffer from being everywhere and nowhere due to other people's commitments taking priority. So as dean, I have said that I'm committed to appointing an associate or assistant dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion to oversee this important work, to make sure that diversity is both everywhere and somewhere. I also plan to form a DEI committee this year comprised of students, faculty, staff, and alumni to examine what we've been doing well and what areas in which we can improve. And I encourage any of you participating in today's webinar to reach out to me if you have an interest in serving on that committee. Because to achieve and sustain gains with regards to our African American student, faculty, and staff populations, it's important for us to first take a look at ourselves and our practices to see how we're either hurting the effort or helping the effort. We need to ask ourselves, in what ways have we erected barriers to achieving our goals? For instance, why is it that despite an average 24% underrepresented student population over the past 5 years, the African American student enrollment has only averaged at 4%? Why is it that we often don't have more than 1 to 3 African American faculty members on the faculty at any given time? My job as dean will be to urge members of our law school community to investigate these and other questions related to our diversity priorities. And with the help of students, faculty, staff, and alumni, to devise concrete strategies and plans to make our law school more diverse and inclusive, where everyone has a positive experience and that everyone feels as if UConn Law belongs to them, because in fact, it does. And to Karen and Connie's point, African American students, faculty and staff, and other marginalized communities don't always feel that way and have not always felt that way with regards to their UConn Law experiences. But as dean, it is my charge and my intention to make sure that that doesn't happen on my watch. I look forward to working with all of you in this endeavor as we work together to ensure that African Americans at the law school and the law school more broadly continues to rise, that we continue to fulfill the promise of making sure that we have a diverse and inclusive and equitable law school community and legal profession. We know that we have made great gains, thanks in large part to wonderful efforts of alumni such as Karen and Connie, but we do know that we have more work to do. We know that there is more progress that can be made. And it's important that we institute practices and we institute strategies that we're not just progressing one day and then retreating the next, We want to make sure that we are progressing and that we are sustaining that progression as we continue to rise. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Dean Nelson, Assistant Dean DeMeola, and Dr. Green for all of your comments and prepared presentation, which we're so grateful for. I want to highlight that this is the opportunity for open conversation as well as we can do that within a virtual context. I'm a firm believer that part of the way that we advance the pursuit of diversity, equity, and inclusion and the pursuit of meaningful equity within the spaces that we exist in is through open conversation and through addressing these issues openly and fairly and conscientiously with each other. So please, if you have that pressing question that you want to ask, now is the time to please raise it in the chat. And while we're waiting for our participants, I will just start with a question to Dr. Green. Dr. Green, I'll be honest, I think I've shared this with you before. I picked up your book at a law school event in the fall and then read it with great interest. Literally could not put it down the very night that I picked it up. So I want to add my comments and gratitude to you for writing this book. Why did you decide to write this book in 2019? What prompted it? Tell us a little bit about the process. And I guess one question that I would ask, and maybe a little sensitive, is was it difficult for you to write about these experiences, to go back to the summer of 1969 and that search for housing and to hear no, 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 and to know what that was about and yet not be able to address it at the time?
Can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I seem to have lost a little bit of the sound in hearing you.
Okay.
But I did get the gist of your question. I am in this third chapter, and I noted I have gotten very involved in research in history. And I have come to understand that we must tell our own stories. And in looking, when I started this project actually in 2017, the end of 2017, it was concerning to me how little information was available at the law school, documentation was available at the law school concerning the African American experience there. There was very little. So one of the goals of why I wanted to do this project was that if you look in the archives and special collections at UConn Law now, you will find not only primary but secondary sources of information on what I've been talking about. I was very pleased to work with the library staff there, particularly Leah Willenius, who was special in terms of helping me collect data and assisting in photographs that we were able to find, and then in doing oral histories. So there are transcribed histories that are part of that collection now. There was a sense of what was difficult for me is feeling visible and invisible all at the same time. And that invisibility means that we have no written record that we were ever there, more than our own kind of memory that's a story among friends. We had no official documentation in the records there. So I am very pleased that I was able to be a part of that in terms of collecting the information and having a process for collecting really solid information and documentation from newspaper articles to actual oral history. And I am a big believer that we tell our stories by our oral histories of what we can write down. Why I included a few of the narratives, and as I said, if you're interested, I'm not sure you can go online and get the actual interviews, but they are in the library once the library is back open again in the special collections. Why I started to collect those, because I realized that as I moved on in my career, I have mentored several Black women lawyers. They sought me out. Either in my career, I worked in civil rights and discrimination, or even those who were working in private practice. And as they shared their stories, I realized some of the early stories that I recalled were very similar to what they were sharing with me after the year 2000. So that, again, was something I had in the back of my mind, that we need to be able to tell our stories because they're helpful for the generations that come after us to know that some things change and some haven't, but in spite of that, we move forward in a very strong way. And I want to share with you again, when you look through the book, please don't omit the appendix. The back, we spent a lot of time on trying to collect just the snapshots of some of these amazing alum who had stories to tell. But then when you look at the kinds of things they've been able to do, it's just amazing. So I was pleased, even though there were points like Karen that I almost stopped a couple of times and said, I don't know if I can do this. It was a little painful, a lot painful, but the story is important because the people involved are amazing. The alum that we have at UConn Law, the Black alum, are amazing. So to be able to collect some of that, and one of the goals that wasn't reached, and hopefully there will be time with now more technology, we wanted to have many more of the alum that were, that've gone through UConn Law be a part of that appendix. I noted as representative. The list that we have there, over 50 as representative. There are many more. And I believe there should be a way to keep that going, that we can have not only our archival piece, but a wonderful piece for networking for the students that are there now. There are many alum that would love to mentor as I did, and some already do. Was there something else you said? I'm not sure.
I think you covered it. Thank you. I think, and there's a related question for you here in the chat from a Jennifer, and the question is, Dr. Green, were any people reluctant to be interviewed during your research?
To be interviewed?
Yes.
No. Everyone was, and I'm looking back, everyone we asked to be interviewed was receptive to that. Now, that's different from saying, were some people cautious about how they framed their answers? I think that is always something that is a possibility. But in terms of engagement in the project, we wish we could have done more. Funds were limited for that from UConn Law, but we wish we could have done more. I think that was a very important part, to do the oral histories. You have to read between the lines for some of the interviews. Some of the people I did know well, and I could read a little bit between the lines, but people were very receptive and encouraged. Encouraged is a good word. They were encouraged that UConn Law was willing to tell the story. And they were encouraged that someone like me would be telling this story so that it would have a sense of credibility.
Thank you. We have another question. What is the percentage of people of color in the law school now? And I know, Dean Nelson, perhaps this question is best directed to you or to Assistant Dean DeMeola.
With regards to our incoming class that just began classes yesterday, our underrepresented minority population is at 28%. But again, our African American enrollment is 4%. So 7 out of 169 students are African American in the incoming class.
And as a follow-up to that question, I think all of you have spoken about the role of gatekeepers and about the importance of representation. Certainly one of the themes of Dr. Green's book was the representation of people of color within the faculty and how that has changed over time. Why does representation matter? Why is it important to be thinking about representation and ensuring that we have diverse populations within the law school community?
I'm happy to begin. For me, representation matters because it helps students see what they can become. I know that for me, it never crossed my mind during law school that I could be a law professor. I didn't see a lot of law professors that looked like me at my law school. But then after getting out in practice and starting to get an interest in teaching and going back to some of my mentors from law school and outside of law school, seeing someone who looks like you makes you think I can be that too. So I think on that level, representation matters. I think it also matters because all of us bring such a diverse background of experiences and perspectives. And particularly in the study of law, it's important that we reflect in our teaching those experiences and those backgrounds. For students of color who are going through a criminal law first year course and not have discussion about the racial injustice and the disparities and the social justice surrounding our criminal law system, that makes students feel as if they don't belong at that institution. That makes them feel as if their lived experiences and the experiences of their family members and their friends are not reflected or cared about in the law. And while it doesn't have to be a professor of color to bring that perspective into the classroom, oftentimes it is, because they too have often lived some of those experiences. So I think for those two reasons, helping students to think bigger about what they can become is why representation matters. And then also to bring that diversity of perspective into the classroom is another reason why having a diverse faculty matters in law school.
Historically, when we were looking at the idea of recruitment for first students, but then what needed to be done in terms of changing the landscape for faculty and administrators at UConn Law, one of the things that came up, and I think continues to come up, is not only recruiting, but retention of students. And retention seems to be surrounded by what does the total law school look like? Remember the one quote I read from Professor Gustafson of one's feelings can be quite different from two different perspectives. And I agree with Dean Nelson that not seeing others on campus at all levels, from administrators, from dean to administrators to faculty to students, at all levels, does create an environment that you have to work harder in if you're so different from that environment. So I see representation as key, and it's always been something that has been a part of what I've seen is important at a law school. I think that would be.
One of the challenges that inevitably comes up when we think about the percentage of students of color in the law school, which Dean Nelson referenced, and the small percentage of African Americans. Back to Dean Nelson's point, seeing yourself represented in the faculty, in the administration is key, right? Like when you look at African Americans at the law school prior to Dean Nelson's arrival, if we don't think about faculty, and you count me out because I'm very aware of the fact that I'm light-skinned, biracial, and that looks different for people, right? I look sort of something, right? People say, what are you? You're something. So it looks different, right? So when you're looking at when you're at the law school and you're visiting, and the African Americans that you see are in administrative roles at the law school, how can you possibly see yourself as being successful, right? You look at the course description, and sure, we have critical race theory, we have a new course, diversity, equity, and inclusion, legal profession. That's important, but it's also important, how long have you had that class? How often is that class offered? How many Black faculty members do you have? Yes, I am very aware of the fact that Dean Nelson, as the first full-time dean, we did have Dean McLean as an interim dean, but to be hired as a dean and to be a Black woman means something for an institution. That is meaningful. Will that immediately increase the number of Black students who matriculate? Maybe, right? It may certainly play a role. But when you look at the national landscape for African American students to law school, it is still the case that African Americans are told from their guidance counselors in their high schools that they cannot be a lawyer. We have pre-law advisors across the country. Even today, we have a student who will not be named, but in the recent history of the law school, who was told by his pre-law advisor at a top law school in New England that he needed to identify that he was Black in some way, otherwise he wouldn't get into law school. That was maybe in 2018, right? Because people still believe that it's a, we get into these arguments about plus factor. Is it a plus factor? Is it not? Now, this student had a fantastic LSAT score, was at a fantastic institution, and that the pre-law advisor still had views based on bias, unconscious or otherwise, right? That still happens, and that disconnect, right? The disconnect between seeing Blacks as successful in the field of law, in particular when you don't see yourself represented, of course you're going to take that in as a personal, internalized viewpoint. Connecticut is not, we're making strides, right, in terms of the diversity of the profession, but many of us can name the Black partners at major law firms in the state of Connecticut, and that matters. And so the efforts that all of us take around diversity, equity, and inclusion can go a long way into diversifying the law school classrooms within our state.
One other comment, if I could make, on representation for students, and it started in those early classes of between 1969 and 79, when the legal clinics were first starting at the law school, and the diversity we brought of wanting to be in Hartford. We actually started one of the first clinics over at Charter Oak. That was representation, working with Black students who were in the dental school, med, and in the School of Social Work. We immediately understood that our connections with Hartford were very important. Why? Maybe because of our backgrounds. We didn't come from Hartford, but we understood the importance of that. And I think the richness of those experiences that you get when you have a diverse student body that Dean Nelson talks about for faculty, you get that richness in the student body too, with the diverse representation. And that one example that I noted quickly was around the early legal clinics.
Dr. Green, Cody Garnieri, who knew you from your time at ECSU, says hi in the chat. And Cody and others have spoken to, I think, the next question, which is, I think all of you have in different ways alluded to the role of the law school as a pipeline. And so there's both the pipeline into law school and thinking about how to connect students to law school and visualizing themselves as attending law school early. But then there's a follow-up question from Attorney Hercules in the chat as well. Hi, Tiana, good to see you here. That talks about the entry or the pipeline into the profession. And so I wonder if all of you could speak to both what can be done in the pipeline, in developing the pipeline into school, into law school, but also in thinking about how do we ensure that our graduates of all backgrounds and all identities, in particular our diverse graduates, are successful as they navigate the legal profession.
Thank you so much, Cecil, for that question, because I think it's so important both at the entry point into law school as well as the entry point into the profession. Particularly, I have heartstrings that pull when we think about pipeline work and getting students, particularly students of color, interested in going to law school. I think, from a lot of our experiences in a lot of communities of color, it is very difficult to imagine beyond your circumstances. It's hard to imagine beyond what you see every day. And if you have not grown up in a community with lawyers, and you've not had the opportunity to meet lawyers, then you don't think about yourself even going to law school. And so I think it's very important, both at the high school level as well as the college level, to give students of color that exposure, to plant that seed that a career in law is rewarding, It's beneficial. It's a way for you to give back to your community in so many different ways, that it is really a wonderful path to take, regardless of what your job may actually be after you graduate. And so having pipeline programs here at UConn Law, and I know that there are already pipeline programs in place here. And again, there were pipeline programs in place that Connie talks about in the book to a part of that legacy. But it's very important that we are very proactive and intentional in having those type of pipeline programs, bringing people on campus when we open back up to make sure that they see that this is attainable for them and that they will have the support networks and the mentorship to make sure that they're successful as they navigate the application process, as well as actually attending law school. So I think engage in that pipeline work, and there are wonderful organizations like the Law School Admissions Council who will give funding to help law schools partner with community organizers to have those type of pipeline programs. They are not inexpensive, but again, there are resources there, and it's a wonderful investment in our future students and our future lawyers.
So one of the challenges for some students, one student, now a graduate, I mean, I have no concept. I've been here for 20 years, and so everyone sort of blends together and everyone feels like they graduated yesterday. But one student summed it up perfectly, sort of the importance of the pipeline and the importance of connections in law school into the profession. In that for many, law school is the most marginalizing experience that some have had in a very long time. In particular, those students who have gone to a historically Black college or university, or have been in New York or DC, or a city that's much larger, or a state that has a far more diversity. And then the practice is even worse. And so engaging not only the high school students and law school students. So what can we do in terms of the firms and the organizations and the bar associations? And so we know that the Crawford Black Bar Association has been extremely important to the development of young leaders and engaging in law school. LCD, SABAC, all the affinity bar associations have been tremendous assets to our students in building that bridge to the profession. The challenges come inevitably in the ways in which unconscious bias and sometimes explicit bias play a role in the hiring process. And so we have many stories of students who, in particular first-generation students who have socioeconomic status that does not allow them to go to Brooks Brothers or whatever the stores are, where you buy fancy suits, right? And so they're buying off the rack suits, and they look awesome, and they go in and someone tells them that, wow, that jacket doesn't match those pants. Or I liked your hair better when it was straightened versus natural. And so what does that tell you about the practice of law? Yes, it may be that one firm or that one interviewer, but oftentimes those messages that we get and our students get at the interview stage can set them up in a negative way and think about the profession as negative, and sort of that the stereotype threat, the imposter syndrome, all of that comes to the forefront. And so having those pipelines into the profession that the bar associations create, that we as the Alumni Association and as alum create, are a tremendous asset to give students the resources, and recent grads the resources to feel like they're not alone, right? That they still belong and there's a place for them in the profession.
Thank you. One of the questions we've had is speaking to the differences in representation year over year. So there's both, it feels a cyclical nature to some of the issues that we're dealing with today, that all of you have seen before, in terms of both our current focus on racial injustice broadly within society, but also our struggles to address an inclusive environment within the law school. And part of perhaps what contributes to that is that there can be significant fluctuations of representation class to class of diverse students. Do you all have thoughts as to how we can address that, and how we can seek to ensure some consistency in the representation of diverse students. So we do create those communities of color year over year.
Well, one of the things.
Oh, sorry,
Go
Dean.
ahead. Go ahead, Connie.
I know this is really your question, but I just want to make a very short comment on this. One of the things, and I'm really into, we learn from our past, and there's some things that work. And one way of increasing representation, at least in those early days, was what they knew about the law school and the experiences of those students who had gone to that law school. And what's that track record? So historically, it's been, if there have been good experiences, it attracts more people to come there. And the other way of increasing has been through the alumni, of what have the alumni who've gone to that school been able to do. And I think that that has been an underutilized part of the UConn story, is really telling the stories of really these amazing African-American alumni. So. Dean.
Yeah, I think, Connie, you raise a great point. And I think one of the things that we always have to remember is that the way that we treat our students of color when they are here with us, that will have an impact on our ability to recruit students of color. So we need to make sure that we are having a very inclusive, welcoming environment in which, when there are issues, they are addressed, that the students feel like the institution has their back, such that they don't have to carry the weight of all of these issues themselves. That diversity is not just a BALSA issue, it's an institution issue. So making sure that we have a supportive environment for them so that they can be great recruiters on our behalf, I think is something that's very important. But the alumni are also incredibly important. And again, it's important for the institution to make sure that we're reaching out to the alumni. Oftentimes, I've found at other institutions that I've been associated with, that the institution feels as if it's the Black alumni or the alumni of color that should be reaching back to the institution, particularly when those alumni of color have not had positive experiences at the institution. That is a disconnect. It is our responsibility as the institution to reach out to those alumni, those who may have had good experience and those that may not have had good experiences, so that we can hear about the experiences they had and the ideas that they have to make sure that our current students are having a better experience. But I've spoken, as I speak to our admissions, our wonderful admissions professionals, one of the benefits of COVID and one of the benefits of going to the CUs that we may not have, had the funds or the time to visit. Going to those minority serving undergraduate institutions to encourage students to think about UConn, to spread the good news about what we have going on here at the law school. I think, again, stretching beyond just our state, just our region, and making sure that we're having a national reach to encourage students and to inform students about the wonderful experiences they could have here would go a long way in helping to sustain those gains that we can make with regards to our student recruitment and our student percentages.
If I can echo off that, there's been a question about faculty retention. And so certainly there have been faculty of diverse backgrounds that have joined the law school and have left the law school. What can we do to ensure that we both are attracting but also retaining diverse faculty in tenure track positions?
Ooh, that's a good question. Let me start at the front end. I think that it's very important that we are trying to hire cohorts of faculty members. It's diversity begets diversity in some ways. And when you're the only person of color or one of just a handful of female faculty members or, things like that, it can be a very isolating environment. And so it's good to make sure that we are building up the number of faculty of color that we have, in particular African-American faculty of color. And so I think when you have that cohort, then the experiences that faculty of color are having are perhaps going to be more positive and therefore play into that retention. But I think it's also important to think about what are the professional and personal goals of all of our faculty members, but particularly our faculty of color. What long-term are they interested in doing? What long-term are they interested in accomplishing? And how can the law school and the university support that? So, I think that that's also an important conversation to have. The final thing that I will say is we need to be mindful that a lot of our faculty of color and staff professionals, as well as our female faculty members, often have to bear the service responsibilities at a much heightened level than some of our other colleagues. And it's important that we are protecting our faculty of color with regards to that we are acknowledging that, and that we are rewarding them for that extra service that they are providing. Because oftentimes that extra service is taking away time that they have for other aspects of their job. So acknowledging that, valuing that, I think that those are some ways to help with the retention of faculty of color.
We are running a bit over on time, but it sounds like there's interest in some further questions. And so I think what we'll do is we have one more question that has been posted in the chat, and then I will pose one more question to close us up. But the question that I'll raise from the chat, the question I'll raise that was raised in another context speaks to allyship. And so obviously much of this conversation has been focused on the narratives of African-American and Black students at the law school and their careers and stories of grit and success thereafter. What is the role of a student who seeks to be an ally right now? And either in the historical context, and certainly we've seen that in your book, Dr. Green, but presently and for alumni, do you all have advice for those who are gathered here clearly with an interest to try to help and be helpful? And perhaps Dr. Green, if I could start with you and then go to Assistant Dean DeMeola and then to Dean Nelson for her comments.
Okay. I will repeat a comment, but maybe expand on it somewhat. The alum that are included in the appendix, over 50, are a really good source for mentorships and connections. They represent they work in diverse areas of the legal profession, from investment banking to journalism to private practice, from judgeships. They really represent the gamut. And I do not know why they had not been tapped. Those interviewed may have done some work at UConn Law, but as they said, sometimes they're not asked. And perhaps the reach out should be, you just make yourself available, but sometimes you have to be asked. And to Dean Nelson's point, if the earlier experiences were not always inclusive of you, I think that there are a number of alum, if there's a process for how they can be included, especially in networking and mentorship for students that are there, would be available. And because the Black alum that are included and others as well represent an international population, clearly across the nation, but some internationally, that I was just amazed to be able to reconnect with some of them in terms of how their careers. So lots of them are still working full time. Some may be in semi-retirement, but still the network is very rich. But there has to be an ask, I think, for some of them, or a process already in place of how you connect. They may not want to create the process. There would need to be something in place or an ask done, I would think.
So in terms of allyship, I think many people have asked this question in the last few months, right? As across the nation, we see many. We've recognized, many have recognized for sometimes the first time, that African Americans are being killed by police and subject to all kinds of discrimination. And so it's sort of, it's good and bad, right? I think it's awesome that we have a whole generation of allies. But when we think about allyship, it's often in this age of social media, sort of this performative allyship where you black out your Instagram post and you sort of write messages that say Black Lives Matter, or you sort of say we need more diversity without really understanding what that looks like. And so I tell people often that to engage in active allyship is a very important step. And sometimes that means just listening to stories without giving excuses, right? We all are proud to be members of the UConn Law family. It does not mean we can't recognize that sometimes the UConn Law family is not as inclusive as we might like. But you should believe the stories that I tell, that Dr. Green tells, that Cecil tells, Christine, Dean Nelson. Our experiences are valid experiences that existed at the law school. And when someone says to you, whether you're a current student in the classroom, if someone says to you, this was a microaggression, right, in the classroom, what do I do about it? Can you just listen to what my perception is and my experience is here? It's important to listen. It's important to sort of honor the narratives that we tell, which is why this book for me was just so empowering, right? That we were telling our stories for the first time, right? Included in the narrative of this institution. And so listen to those stories and believe them and act, right? We often talk about unconscious bias, and Cecil and I do these trainings often. And so examine your bias, examine your privilege, and how both of those things play out. What opportunities are you getting that your Black colleague is not getting? Call out bias when you see it, engage in honest conversations, be vulnerable, lean into this discomfort, and understand that a claim by one about being marginalized is not about you losing an opportunity or about you being given an opportunity simply because you are white, for instance. There's no disconnection, there's no discounting of your experience and your merit and your abilities, but instead it's about mine or somebody else's, a person of color's experience within, could be the same organization. But engage in those conversations and be vulnerable. And I know that's hard for many of us. And allow people to speak their truths while you speak yours, and sort of stand in the shadows and listen.
I couldn't agree more with Connie and Karen on those points. I really don't have, much to add to that, but I think it is so important to engage in those difficult conversations. I think through those difficult conversations where you are there listening, empathizing, and really taking in the experiences of people who are different from you and have had different experience than you, and that validation that you give, that is what starts to break down barriers. That is what starts to erect growth, and to help people really see one another and see how they can partner so that we can all be better together. Because when you have these barriers, when you're looking at things of, well, this is mine and that is yours, and if I give you this, then that's going to be taken away from me, and all of these kinds of things, we continue to be in this profession and in this society that is not living up to its ideals. And so until we engage in the hard conversations in which we can be honest with one another while also showing grace to one another, only then can there really be true growth and true empathy and true progress.
Thank you. And this is our last question, and then I'll turn it over to Christine to close. But I think what so many of us are wrestling with right now is that we've had this incredible renewed focus on questions of race, questions of addressing structural racism. Some have compared this to a combination of 1918 and 1968 all in one moment. And my question for all of you is this a lasting moment? How do we make this a lasting moment? And what does this story look like 10 years from now if we've succeeded in ensuring that this is a lasting moment of change?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a difficult question. I think obviously, I think it is all our hope and desire that it is a lasting moment. In order for that to happen, there really needs to be structural changes. There needs to be investment in bringing about those structural changes. And I think that if we do that, then, for instance, at UConn Law, I think that we will see an even more diverse community. I think that we will hear stories of more positive experiences in which students of color and other marginalized groups of students and faculty and staff feel valued and feel that their voice is, wanted and heard and listened to, and that we have broken down barriers that make it harder for students of color to get clerkships, that make it harder for students of color to get positions in law firms. We have broken down structures that say that only law professors only need to come from 3 or 4 different law schools. We will see diversity in the backgrounds of our law professors and the law schools that they've graduated from and the disciplines that they've been engaged in. So, seeing actionable and measurable goals such as that achieved, for me, will be a sign of a lasting legacy at UConn Law.
And I hope there will be continued conversations on at the law school on campus, especially you have a new entering class coming in. If they're not already there, they will be there remotely or virtually any day. And how does that first year look for them in terms of creating the environment of their expectations from their differences? And I applaud differences. We're not trying to make everyone the same. We're really utilizing their differences to enrich the environment. But I would hope that as we think about experiences in the future for the students there, that includes a way to have conversations across different groups. I think the individual groups, BALSA, and the number of groups that Karen has now mentioned that are at the law school have conversations all the time, but how to create bridges for those conversations, I think would be very helpful. Students today are pretty vocal on what they'd like to see and not see. The bridges across that for conversations are, I think, something the law school could do very well. And then the other, because as a historian, I do believe history is very important. If there's a way for people to hear some of those true interviews, Karen is one of those that was interviewed as well, of their experiences in their words, I think is also helpful, because you do find that when you hear from someone else that may be 10, 15, 30 years ago, and you say, gee, I've experienced some of that too, you don't feel alone. You feel more likely to share. So I think that dialogue, UConn is in a perfect position to do that. And you're right, with digital, with Zoom and everything else, there are wonderful ways to create these new communities for students and for faculty.
I echo everything that was already said. I know you know this about me, Cecil, like the gatekeepers for me in 10 years, perhaps we look different, right? The LSAT is abolished, the bar exam is abolished, and we figure out a different way to have open access to the profession. That's always my fantasy, and that has been for some time, but it takes a long road to get there, right? I mean, we are a profession that is steeped in tradition. We are the nutmeg state. the land of steady habits. But I think that certainly the sort of the confluence of these two very important moments in our history, right? The pandemic and a national recognition of systemic racism allows us to really think differently about the practice. Not only technology and having hearings via Zoom and meeting Judge Carroll via Teams, but instead also sort of the ways in which we can look long-term about, long-term goals of thinking about legal education in the profession and how people gain access to that and what that looks like. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to really think about the systems in place, why they're in place, and what changes may need to be made.
All right, so we want to thank everyone for participating. This session has been recorded. There were a series of questions that we didn't get a chance to follow up with, so we will do so in a subsequent thank you email. We'll try to figure out how best to do so. And this is more to come. This is the first of many sessions on diversity, equity, inclusion at the law school. So we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you for our attendees. A very special thank you to our panelists for providing their knowledge and insight. And we will be back with you guys soon. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe.